Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be wrapping up all of the books that I read in June. So I'm going to be bringing you little mini reviews of everything I read in the month. I read 9 books and this was definitely my best reading month of the year so far. I'd mentioned a couple of times here on the channel and also over on my Bookstagram account, which you can find linked down below in the description. I mentioned a few times that I had a really good reading year. I was reading way more than I read in the couple of years previous. I was reading really good books, but I hadn't had those 5-star reads that I absolutely loved. And in June, I had 2 5-star reads and they are new, absolute favorites, not even favorite books of the year, but new all-time favorites. So I will let you know about those books when I get to them. I'm gonna start though by talking about the one non-fiction book that I read in June, and that was Killjoy by Jo Cheatham. So this is actually a proof copy from last year. The book came out last year, and it is the author's memoir but focused on her involvement in the No More Page 3 campaign. So if you don't know what Page 3 is, if you're from a country where Page 3 wasn't a thing, in the Sun newspaper, which is a tabloid newspaper, there was this section on page 3 of the paper, which is basically young women with their tits out. And it's one of those things where if you came up with it today, like a national tabloid newspaper where the 3rd page of the paper that was very accessible to children had that kind of content on it, people would think that's mad, what a ridiculous idea to come up with. But it was kind of this tabloid newspaper institution. And this book is about Jo kind of tiptoeing into activism. She kind of reluctantly, but then very passionately and dedicated, becomes a campaigner and an activist. We follow her life and her involvement in the No More Page 3 campaign, as well as her fellow campaigners and activists as they take on this media empire. They organise protests, they go to parliamentary debates. I definitely remember Page 3 being a thing as a kid, and I definitely remember the height of the No More Page 3 campaign. I think I was at university and really taking my first steps into feminist activism when the campaign was at its height. It was really interesting to learn about that campaign from the perspective of someone that was so heavily involved, but it was also a really inspiring story about how one person can make a difference. You know, if you are sat at home and you really passionately care about a cause, but you don't know how to get involved, how to make a difference, if you feel like you are just one small voice, this book really shows you how you can make a lasting impact. I do have one small criticism in that I feel like some of the anecdotes in this book were a little bit repetitive. I do feel like there were times when the author was repeating herself, but in the grand scheme of how much value I got from this book, it's a minor criticism. I also read a poetry collection in June, and it is my favourite poetry collection that I've read in a really long time, and that is And Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. So I had read some of the poems in this collection before, but I'd never read the whole thing, and I absolutely loved it. I've been struggling with poetry recently and finding the kind of poetry that I really like. It used to be something that I read way more of than I do at the minute. I've read a few of Maya Angelou's memoirs as well. I think she has quite a few, maybe 6 or 7. I've read 1 or 2 of them. But I love how she expressed elements of her identity in this collection. Much of it deals with womanhood and specifically Black womanhood in the States. She speaks of freedom and partying and Saturday nights. It's evocative and dramatic, but it is also incredibly playful with sound effect and language. And I think that's what I really value in poetry. I love when it is rhythmic and sound is played with and words are playful. There were so many standout poems in this collection for me, and I already want to reread it. Phenomenal Women was one of my favorites. And Country Lover is just a very short 6-line poem, but it was so brilliant. So I would really highly recommend this collection. I also read a classic in June. I know, who is she? I would love to commit to reading just 1 classic a month for the rest of the year. Will I do that? It's a loose goal, okay? Maybe. But I read Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell in less than a day. It is quite a short classic, but I completely flew through it. I had read North and South when I was at university, and I've come to accept that my opinions on that novel are basically incorrect, because I think I just read it at a time when I wasn't really engaging with it, and perhaps if I read it now I would enjoy it much more. Because if I enjoyed Cranford so much, I can only assume that I actually should have enjoyed what is thought of as her best work, North and South. I should have enjoyed that much more, so maybe I should revisit that one day. But Cranford is basically a book that centers around a lot of women like gossiping. So it's set in this village in the 19th century. It's a community dominated by women, and much of the unspoken etiquette that they all kind of adhere to, these social norms that are just like the way things are done, and to deviate from those social norms is like not a good thing. But one of the things that I found really interesting about the dynamic between all of the women in this village was their kind of ignorance to each other's poverty. These women are really focused on keeping up appearances and keeping up the social norms, and we see them participating in this kind of genteel society when they don't actually have much money at all. Their days are centered around playing cards and having tea and gossiping. Like, I loved the gossip in this book. Like, they're always on the hunt for like a bit of scandal to talk about. There is a slight mystery in this book, which I didn't think was particularly mysterious. There's rumors of burglary, there is a missing person, but I did really enjoy this one. Now onto some more contemporary fiction. I read Begin Again by Helly Acton. So I have read a couple of Helly Acton's previous books, The Shelf and The Couple, and I really enjoyed those books. I didn't enjoy this one quite as much, but it did have some of the elements of those books that I really enjoyed. Her books kind of have these experimental twists to female-focused kind of popular fiction. There's an element of fantasy or science fiction that acts as a springboard for kind of a thought experiment, I suppose. So our main character in this one is a young woman named Frankie who is feeling dissatisfied in many areas of her life. She's really feeling unsettled, like something is missing in her career, her friendships, her romantic relationships. She is on what she perceives to be a real dud of a first date, and she runs off from this date and she goes to the kebab shop, and then in this kind of random accident she ends up dying. And it is then that she is offered a second chance. She is offered the opportunity to live 24 hours in various scenarios that would have been her life if she had taken a different decision at particular points in her life. So sort of a sliding doors kind of moment. If she had decided to move somewhere, what would her life have ended up like? If she accepted a marriage proposal, what would her life have ended up like? So she has these various scenarios where she sees where her life might have ended up. It's a book about life's what ifs or missed chances. And I suppose it's something that we all kind of ponder about our lives. You know, if we had done this one particular thing slightly differently, if we made a different decision in that moment, if we'd taken a different opportunity. I think the reason I didn't like this book as much as her other books, and I will caveat that with saying, like, I found this a really enjoyable read, but I found that, you know, the resolution and the payoff was so obvious. Like, I think even talking about the premise of this book, you kind of know what the resolution should be. The takeaway message is that she has the power to change her life. The only one that was holding her back from finding contentment and passion in her life was herself. In the way her life ended up, she has the power to get everything that she really wanted. She was the only one holding herself back. The things that she learns from those what if scenarios, about the things that she liked about how those life situations ended up, but also the things that she didn't like. She has the power to control her own narrative. I think the message of taking charge of your life in the here and now instead of worrying or fantasizing about the what if situations, from the beginning of the book, from the premise of the book, you know that that's going to be the message. I did enjoy reading this book. I did enjoy seeing how all of the different scenarios panned out. But I think the reason I just didn't enjoy it as much as I have Helly Acton's previous books was because it left me with less to think about compared to those other books. Like, those other books, I have thought about them and I still think about them really quite often, and the kind of thought experiments it prompted and reflection it prompted from me personally, I didn't get that so much with this book. But as I said, I did really enjoy the process of reading it nonetheless. I also read Weirdo by Sarah Pascoe. So you may know this author from some of her nonfiction writing or for being a stand-up comedian. I've not read any of her nonfiction before, but I've listened to her on various podcasts. I know about her comedy. I was really intrigued to see what a fiction book would be like from her. And there were some parts of this book that I really liked and some parts of these books I didn't so much. So sometimes when comedians write fiction, I don't love it because I feel like I'm very aware of them trying to be funny. And I don't think that humor necessarily translates on the page in the same way it would in like a sketch or a stand-up routine. And I'm really glad that the author didn't do that in this book. Like, there are definitely observation and elements that are funny, but I don't feel like the author was constantly trying to get gags in and make me laugh, because I can find that really jarring when comedians do that when they write fiction. It's quite difficult to sum up what this book is kind of about. It's about a young woman named Sophie who lives in Essex, and it's about her complicated family relationships and romantic relationships. And I guess at some points in this book, it's kind of about her just trying to get a boyfriend, but it's not really about that. She's a really unreliable narrator, and you come to understand her as a character in a way that she doesn't even really understand herself. And because you are so kind of seeing things from her perspective, but also able to see the reality of situations that she isn't even really able to perceive because she's kind of so focused on herself and her inner thoughts, and she perceives situations in ways that aren't really true. You get so much of her kind of like weird inner thoughts. Like, she really perceives herself to be a bit of a weirdo, as the title suggests. But actually some of her inner thoughts are kind of reflective of ways that I'm sure a lot of people have felt throughout their lives, particularly young women, kind of trying to be a grown-up but don't really know how because there's no manual on how to be a grown-up. There's some really astute observations about things people think and feel but don't share with people because you feel like, oh god, that's a weird thing for me to feel or think or talk about. Sophie's also in a lot of financial debt, which isn't actually something that I've read about all that much in fiction, and I guess it's something that is a taboo that people experience and don't really talk about. They were the things that I really appreciated about this book, but when I think about the actual reading experience of it, I was a bit bored. Like, not a huge amount happens in the book. Sophie is navigating her romantic and sexual relationships in a way that isn't very healthy. She has really dysfunctional relationships with her parents and her sister, and it's leading up to her sister's wedding, which is very complicated and messy and dysfunctional, but not a huge amount happens. And I think that's why I felt a bit bored. It was a bit kind of like, okay, where are we going? Where are we driving towards? So I don't know. I have quite mid feelings on this book. I'd love to know if you have read this one and what you thought about it, because I'm really struggling to figure out exactly how I feel. Okay, I feel like I've waited long enough to tell you about my favorite book of the year so far, and that is The Wishing Game by Meg Schaefer. I think the best way to sum this book up is like a middle grade fantasy for adults. We are following Lucy Hart, who is a young woman who felt neglected in much of her childhood and found solace between the pages of her favourite books, particularly a series called Clock Island by an author called Jack Masterson. She's now 26, she's working as a teacher's aide, and there is a young boy, a 7-year-old boy that she works with that she would really like to adopt. But because she doesn't have any stability, whether that's, financially or her housing situation, she is not going to be able to adopt this little boy called Christopher. Meanwhile, the author of that Clock Island series, Jack Masterson, announces that he has written a new book. And he is hosting this really quite fantastical, mysterious competition where 4 contestants are going to be invited to compete in a series of challenges on the island, and if you win a copy of this book, the only copy of this manuscript in existence. Having this manuscript, having the rights to sell it for a huge amount of money would be life-changing for whoever wins. And Lucy is one of the 4 competitors in this contest. They go through a series of challenges and puzzles and riddles, with Jack puppeteering in this kind of games master way. I think if you are someone that loves children's books, that loves middle grades books as an adult, as I do, seeing a plot that you would find in a middle grade book but with an adult grown-up perspective to it is just so much fun. In many ways, it reminds me of how I felt reading a book called The Magicians by Lev Grossman, which really interrogated why we really want to go to these fantasy worlds when they are so dangerous. It really interrogated our relationships with those fantasy worlds. If you are someone that, grew up loving fantasy series and wanting to find yourself in the world of that series, I think I really enjoyed that element of this book as well. I already want to reread this one. It is my favourite book of the year so far. I also read 3 YA books in June. The first of those was Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. I read The Hate You Give years ago and I absolutely loved it. It's such a powerful and important book, but I've not read anything from Angie Thomas since, and I'm so glad that I picked this one up. This is set 17 years before The Hate You Give, and the stories are linked in a way that was really enjoyable. You see the story of Star's parents, but more specifically her father, and I loved that idea of, sharing the parents' story when they were the age that their kid are. Teenagers don't think about what their parents were like when they were teenagers, the fact that they lived their own lives and experienced the things that teenagers do. 17-year-old Maverick has a dad that is in prison, a mother that is working 2 jobs. The only way he feels like he can help and make money is by selling drugs. But when he ends up being a father at 17, he decides that he needs to step away from the lifestyle of selling drugs. He's trying to finish school, he's trying to make money, and he's also trying to care for a baby. He is trying his absolute best, but it is, of course, so tremendously difficult. I'd never read a book before that was from the perspective of a teenage father trying to do his best. I also loved how nuanced the depiction of the mother was. Effectively, she does abandon the baby, but the perspective we get on her is not one of judgment. Like, she's not painted as a villain. You do have a huge amount of empathy for how difficult she has found the situation. She certainly makes not great choices, but I think everyone in this book does, and so do all teenagers. This book's a brilliant depiction of being a young Black man with such heavy responsibilities on your shoulders and trying to do what's right in a very complicated situation. It's unlike any book that I've ever read before. I don't think I've read a book that is from the perspective of a teenage father before. This was a really excellent book. So the next 2 books are published by the place that I work, and you may remember at the start of the video I mentioned that there were 2 books that were absolute new lifetime favorites for me, and the second of those books is Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. I feel like I'm the only person that hasn't read this book up until now. I think because it was one of those books that is so celebrated and beloved, particularly as this kind of cult classic cornerstone of queer young adult literature, I felt this pressure of oh God, what if I don't like it? Obviously, I loved it. It's completely brilliant. So it's about 2 teenage boys, Ari and Dante, who initially don't seem to have that much in common, but as they start to spend more and more time together, they develop a really special friendship, and we are following the course of that friendship as it develops, as it becomes complicated, as they grow distant from one another but then reconnect. This book just perfectly captured how everything that you feel as a teenager, particularly in relation to love, friendship, family, first experiences of love and sexuality, how everything is the most intense thing you have ever felt because you have never experienced it before. No one has taught you how to deal with those feelings and how messy they are. And it feels like you are experiencing the most profound thing that nobody has ever experienced before. It looks at how you make mistakes and say the wrong thing, how you struggle to come to terms with who you really are as you go through this journey of discovering, as the title says, discovering the secrets of the universe. I think that title just perfectly encapsulates how they are just finding out things about themselves, but it feels as monumental as the whole universe. Both of these characters go through really emotionally intense experiences. There are so many more things I could say about how brilliant I thought this book was, but I'll just finish by saying I completely understand why this book is so formative for so many people and why it has become this kind of cult classic cornerstone of not only queer YA, but, you know, young adult literature overall. It perfectly captures that feeling of intensity, of feeling those feelings for the very first time. It's brilliant. And the final book I'm going to talk about today is another book that is published by the place that I work, and that is Forget Me Not by Alison Derrick. So you may know Alison Derrick from the book that she co-authored with her wife, Rachel Lippincott. That book is She Gets the Girl. But this is a solo novel from Alison Derrick. This is the love story of Stevie and Nora, who are two teenage girls that are in love. But one night, Stevie is in an accident and 2 years of her memory are wiped. So she doesn't remember Nora at all. She doesn't remember their relationship. And in fact, her memory is wiped so far back that she hasn't gone through the journey that she'd been through mentally in terms of understanding her sexuality and that she likes girls. That's obviously a really difficult situation for Nora to be dealing with. You know, not only does the love of her life not remember who she is, but she doesn't even remember that she likes girls. She doesn't remember how people have reacted to her, you know, coming out. She doesn't remember the plan that she and her girlfriend has to leave a town that wasn't accepting of them and their relationship. And little by little, we follow these girls rebuilding a connection and Stevie piecing together her sense of identity and how her life changed in those 2 years that are absent from her memory. I always find it really interesting reading queer YA that is set in America, particularly kind of like small town conservative America, because I think how prejudice manifests in those small communities in America, particularly kind of like rural or Christian ones, is so different from stuff that myself and a lot of my queer friends have experienced. That's not to say that, you know, the people I know aren't from, you know, small towns that maybe weren't used to be there being, you know, queer people. That's not to say that's the case, but I think when I see it depicted in American young adult fiction, it really feels like something I don't recognize from my own experiences or experiences that my friends and peers have had. There's just something very particularly American about it. So I find it really interesting to read about that because it's something that, you know, I've not experienced. What I did experience growing up as a young queer person was a real lack of fiction that depicted relationships between two girls. So I'm so happy that there is more fiction out there that shows female-female relationships in a really positive light. And I did really enjoy reading this one. I read it really quickly, which is always a very good sign. So that is it. They are the books that I read in June. As I said, it was the best reading month that I've had of the year so far, and I'm really keen to carry that momentum into my July reading. Do leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, or let me know what the best book you read in June was. If you want to let me know you're here but you don't have anything in particular to say, leave me a rose emoji or any kind of flower emoji in honor of Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. If you want to keep up with me elsewhere, my Twitter and my Instagram are always linked down below in the description. On Twitter, you'll get more of like my career publishing stuff, and over on Instagram, there's just more like bookish reading goodness. That is it for me today. I hope you're well, and I'll speak to you in my next video.